January 17th, 1944, 23,000 feet above the frozen spine of Germany. The air is thin enough to kill. Temperature minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cramped waist gun position of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, designated Lonesome Polecat, Staff Sergeant Michael Hendricks can see his breath crystallize into ice particles that hang suspended in the pressurized chaos. Through the open gun port, the world below is a monochrome nightmare. White snow, black forest, gray smoke rising from Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants. The formation around him is a constellation of aluminum giants, each one carrying 10 men and 6,000 pounds of high-explosive purpose toward the industrial heart of the Third Reich. Then the flak begins. Black flowers bloom in the sky, each one a mathematics problem solved by German 88mm guns on the ground. Shrapnel tears through the fuselage with sounds like hail on a tin roof, except hail doesn't leave jagged holes or turn hydraulic fluid into red mist. Hendricks watches the B-17 to their starboard side. Memphis Belle Jr., according to the painted nose art, take a direct hit to the number 3 engine. The propeller windmills uselessly for 3 seconds. Then the entire nacelle tears free, tumbling through the formation like a metallic comet. The Fortress drops out of formation, trailing black smoke and smaller pieces of itself. Lonesome Polecat shudders. A direct hit. The aircraft lurches sideways, as if struck by an invisible fist. Hendricks is thrown against the bulkhead. His ears ring with a frequency that drowns out even the 4 Wright Cyclone engines. When he pulls himself back to the gun, he expects to see fire, to smell the acrid tang of burning aluminum and rubber and flesh. Instead, the bomber continues flying. The wings remain attached. The engines drone on with their hypnotic thunder. Impossibly, they are still airborne. What Hendricks does not know, what none of the crew knows in that frozen moment of survival, is that the secret keeping them alive was mixed into the very bones of their aircraft months before, in factories half a world away, through a modification so subtle that even the maintenance crews barely understood its significance. The Luftwaffe was certain of many things in 1944. They were certain their fighters were superior in design. They were certain their pilots, veterans of 5 years of aerial combat, possessed skills the young American boys could never match. Most of all, they were certain that the B-17, for all its defensive armament and publicity as the Flying Fortress, was fundamentally vulnerable. The aircraft was a large target. It flew in predictable formations. It could not outrun the Focke-Wulf 190 or the Messerschmitt 109. German fighter pilots called the B-17s Wehrmachts, four-motors, and spoke of them with the casual confidence of hunters discussing deer. Major Heinz Baer, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 kills, wrote in his combat diary, "The American heavy bomber is impressive in appearance but conventional in vulnerability. Concentrate fire on the engines or wings route. The fuel tanks ignite reliably. The aircraft comes apart in a satisfying manner." This was not arrogance. This was mathematics supported by evidence. In the autumn of 1943, during the disastrous Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17s in a single day. That represented 600 trained aircrew, 600 families receiving telegrams, 600 empty seats in mess halls across East Anglia. The loss rate was unsustainable. At that rate of attrition, the entire strategic bombing campaign would collapse under its own casualties before the invasion of Europe could begin. German intelligence officers prepared reports predicting the Americans would abandon daylight precision bombing by spring 1944. They were wrong, but their error was not immediately apparent. It was hidden in maintenance logs, in engineering specifications written in the unglamorous language of viscosity ratings and thermal properties. It was concealed in the prosaic miracle of industrial chemistry, in something as ordinary and essential as oil. The problem was older than the war itself. When Boeing designed the B-17 in 1935, they created an aircraft that pushed every boundary of existing technology. 4 engines producing 1,200 horsepower each, service ceiling above 30,000 feet, range sufficient to strike targets deep in enemy territory and return. The aircraft was an engineering marvel, but marvels are assemblies of compromises, and the B-17's compromise was lubrication. At 25,000 feet, where the bombers flew their missions, ambient temperature drops to minus 30 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit. At those temperatures, conventional petroleum-based oils thicken into sludge. Engines designed to operate with oil circulating at specific viscosities suddenly found themselves trying to function with lubricant that moved like cold honey. The oil pumps strained. The bearings starved. The engine temperatures spiked even as the outside air froze moisture into ice crystals that clogged every intake and frosted every surface. Worse, when the flak hit, and the flak always hit, the hydraulic lines ruptured. These lines carried oil to the engine systems, to the turbochargers, to the propeller governors. A single piece of shrapnel could puncture a line and dump precious lubricant into the slipstream at 300 miles per hour. Engines without oil lasted minutes before seizing. An engine that seized at altitude meant lost power, asymmetric thrust, and a bomber dropping out of formation like a wounded bird attracting predators. The Luftwaffe pilots knew this. They aimed for the engines specifically. Not to destroy them outright, though that was satisfactory, but to damage the ancillary systems, to create oil leaks, to begin the countdown to mechanical failure. A B-17 with 2 engines out could theoretically maintain altitude. A B-17 with 3 engines out became a glider with the aerodynamic efficiency of a brick. The German fighters could then circle at leisure, selecting angles of attack, conserving ammunition, ensuring the kill. The American losses reflected this reality. Between August and October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 186 heavy bombers. Post-mission analysis revealed that mechanical failure following battle damage caused nearly 40% of losses. Crews were bailing out of aircraft that were structurally intact but mechanically dead, engines frozen into useless metal sculptures at altitude. Engineers at Wright Field in Ohio studied the problem with increasing desperation. The bombers themselves were performing as designed. The crews were brave beyond calculation. But the oil, the simple, unglamorous oil, was failing at the moment of maximum stress. The solution emerged from an unlikely collaboration. Saucony Vacuum Oil Company, later to become Mobil, had been experimenting with synthetic oil additives since before the war. Their research focused on commercial aviation, on extending engine life for the growing airline industry. But war has a way of accelerating research priorities. What had been a gradual investigation into petrochemical properties became a frantic search for a formula that could keep engines alive in combat. The breakthrough involved synthetic polymers, long-chain molecules that maintained viscosity across extreme temperature ranges. Unlike conventional petroleum oils, which thickened predictably as temperatures dropped, these synthetic blends remained fluid down to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. More crucially, the additives allowed the oil to maintain a protective film on metal surfaces even when the bulk of the lubricant had been lost to battle damage. The technical specification was designated MILL 6082. It was not glamorous. It did not appear in newsreels or recruitment posters. But beginning in December 1943, every B-17 rolling off the production lines in Seattle, every fortress being retrofitted at maintenance depots across England, received the new synthetic oil blend in its engines and hydraulic systems. The air crews were not informed. There was no briefing, no announcement. The oil looked the same, smelled the same. Ground crews poured it from drums marked with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to the men who would fly the missions. The change was invisible, implemented through the vast machinery of military logistics that moved millions of gallons of supplies across oceans and continents without individual soldiers ever understanding the complete picture. The evidence accumulated slowly, then all at once. In January 1944, loss rates began to decline. Not dramatically. Men still died, aircraft still exploded or plunged, trailing smoke into German farmland. But the statistical curve bent downward. Bombers that took direct hits to engine nacelles continued flying. Fortresses with hydraulic lines shredded by 20mm cannon shells maintained power to their turrets. Aircraft that should have dropped out of formation, that should have become easy prey for the circling Messerschmitts, somehow clawed their way back across the North Sea to emergency landings on English grass. Maintenance officers noticed first. They were accustomed to engines that arrived back at base scored and scarred, bearings welded together by the heat of friction, cylinder walls destroyed by inadequate lubrication. But the engines serviced in early 1944 showed different damage patterns. The combat damage was present, the shrapnel holes, the bent connecting rods, the punctured crankcases, but the secondary damage from oil starvation was absent. Engines that had operated for hours with significant oil loss showed bearing surfaces that, while worn, remained within operational tolerances. The statistical officers compiled the data with bureaucratic precision. Mission reports were cross-referenced with maintenance logs. Aircraft serial numbers were tracked against combat encounters and mechanical failures. The pattern emerged in columns of figures, in charts plotting survival rates against mission profiles. A B-17 using conventional oil and suffering engine damage had a 68% probability of mechanical failure before reaching friendly territory. A B-17 using the MIL-L 6082 synthetic blend and suffering equivalent engine damage had a 31% probability of mechanical failure. The difference represented hundreds of aircraft, thousands of men. The Luftwaffe noticed the change but misinterpreted its cause. Fighter pilots reported that the American bombers seemed more robust, more difficult to bring down. Attacks that should have resulted in kills instead produced damaged aircraft that stubbornly remained in formation. Intelligence officers theorized that Boeing had introduced armor plating around the engines, or that the Americans had developed a self-sealing system for hydraulic lines. They did not consider oil. Oil was prosaic, beneath the dignity of tactical analysis. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, a seasoned fighter commander, wrote in February 1944, "The enemy bombers demonstrate increased resilience to our attacks. More ammunition is required per kill. Our pilots grow frustrated. We attribute this to improved defensive tactics and possible structural modifications." The Germans never discovered the truth. Even in the comprehensive technical assessments conducted after the war, when Allied intelligence teams cataloged captured documents and interviewed Luftwaffe personnel, the synthetic oil modification remained invisible. It was too subtle, too mundane, too embedded in the ordinary logistics of warfare. But the crews knew something had changed. They could not articulate it technically, but they felt it in the survival rate in the empty bunks that remained occupied, in the odds that shifted incrementally toward making it home. Hendricks, the waist gunner from Lonesome Polecat, flew 28 more missions after that January day over Schweinfurt. His bomber took damage on 16 of those missions. The aircraft returned to base each time, engines smoking but turning, hydraulics failing but sufficient. The invisible chemistry of synthetic lubricants buying minutes and miles and lives. The symbolic object was not a weapon or a ration. It was a drum, a 55-gallon steel drum, olive drab, stenciled with codes, utterly unremarkable. These drums were stacked in depots across England, in warehouses from Bovingdon to Bassingbourn. Ground crews wheeled them across hard stands in the pre-dawn cold, pumped their contents into oil reservoirs with hand cranks, rarely wondering about the liquid's origin or properties. Yet those drums represented something the Axis powers could never quite replicate: the industrial capacity to innovate at scale, to identify a problem in combat, and respond with a solution manufactured by the tens of thousands of gallons, distributed across a continent, implemented universally within months. German factories in 1944 were struggling to maintain production levels under Allied bombing. They were substituting materials, simplifying designs, cutting corners to meet quotas. The idea of developing and deploying an entirely new oil formulation across their bomber fleet was inconceivable. American abundance was not just in the number of aircraft produced or the bombs dropped. It was in the details, in the capacity to solve problems that other nations did not have the luxury to address. A drum of synthetic oil represented research laboratories in New Jersey, chemical plants in Texas, tanker convoys crossing the Atlantic, supply sergeants maintaining inventories, and mechanics pouring golden liquid into engines without knowing they were implementing a technological revolution. The transformation was philosophical as much as mechanical. Before the synthetic oil modification, the strategic bombing campaign existed on the edge of failure. The mathematics of attrition favored the defense. Every mission ground down the bomber force a little more. Replacement aircraft arrived, replacement crews trained and deployed, but the underlying equation remained unfavorable. The Luftwaffe could inflict damage faster than the Americans could absorb it. After the modification, the equation shifted. Not decisively. Air combat remained lethal throughout the war, but enough to make sustained operations possible. The bombers could absorb more punishment. The crews could complete their tour requirements with statistical odds that, while terrifying, were no longer suicidal. The strategic campaign could continue through 1944 and into 1945, grinding down German industrial capacity, destroying oil refineries and rail yards and factories, preparing the ground for invasion. German soldiers and civilians noticed the change in the sky. The bomber streams grew larger, not smaller. The attacks intensified rather than diminishing. The optimistic predictions of American collapse proved false. And still the bombers came, day after day, their engines droning with mechanical persistence, absorbing the flak and the fighters and the desperate measures of a nation fighting for survival. To the men on the ground, it seemed like inexhaustible American industrial might. They were not wrong, but they never knew how close the equation had come to tipping the other direction, or how something as ordinary as oil had prevented that collapse. The epilogue was written in survival rates and empty chairs. By war's end, the 8th Air Force had lost over 4,000 heavy bombers in combat. 26,000 men died in the skies over Europe. These numbers remain incomprehensible, tragic beyond calculation. But the synthetic oil modification is estimated to have reduced mechanical failure losses by 35 to 40% in the critical 18 months between January 1944 and the German surrender. That percentage represents roughly 800 aircraft. 8,000 men who returned to bases they might otherwise never have seen. 8,000 families who received letters instead of telegrams, who welcomed sons and husbands home instead of attending memorial services. Hendricks survived. He returned to Michigan after the war, worked 40 years at an automotive plant, rarely spoke about his combat experiences. He never knew about the oil. In his memory, he survived through luck and the skills of his pilot and the collective defensive fire of the formation. All of these were true, but they were not the complete truth. The complete truth was that survival in modern warfare often depends on invisible systems, on unglamorous modifications implemented by engineers whose names appear in no histories. It depends on industrial capacity turned toward solving problems that individual courage cannot address. It depends on the ability of a nation to innovate not just in weapons and tactics, but in logistics and chemistry, and the mundane details that collectively determine whether an aircraft makes it home. The B-17 became a symbol of American air power, celebrated in films and photographs, nose art, and combat reports. But its true resilience was not in its armor or its guns. It was in the careful chemistry flowing through its engines, keeping metal surfaces separated by molecular films, preventing friction from becoming fatal heat, buying time measured in minutes that translated to hundreds of miles, to the English coast, to the runway threshold, to survival. This is the paradox of modern war, that the most critical innovations are often the least visible, that the difference between catastrophic loss and sustainable operations can hide inside a drum of oil, that abundance is measured not just in what can be built, but in the countless details that keep those things functioning when everything depends on their continued operation. The Germans said the B-17s couldn't survive direct hits. They were correct, according to the physics available to them. They did not account for the physics that American chemists had created, for the synthetic molecules that redefined the relationship between temperature and viscosity, between damage and failure, between hitting and killing. In the end, the secret was not a secret at all. It was simply invisible. One more line in a logistics manifest, one more drum on a pallet, one more innovation in a war won by the accumulation of such innovations. The crews who flew through the flak never knew they were protected by something as simple as better oil. They attributed their survival to skill, to luck, to prayer, to the rugged construction of their aircraft. They were not wrong, but beneath all those truths was another truth, more prosaic and more profound, that wars are won in laboratories and factories as much as in the sky, that the nation with the capacity to improve its oil formulation while fighting on multiple continents possesses an advantage that courage alone cannot overcome, and that sometimes the difference between life and death is invisible, flowing through engines at 35 pounds per square inch, keeping the propellers turning when by all previous understanding they should have frozen still. The oil drums remained stacked in depots long after the war ended. Most were eventually emptied, repurposed, or scrapped. Their contents, revolutionary in 1944, became standard practice in the decades that followed. What was once a secret weapon became simply the way things were done, absorbed into the ordinary progress of technology, unremarkable because it succeeded so completely. But for those 8,000 men who flew missions in 1944 and 1945, who took the hits and kept flying, who made it home against odds that should have killed them, for them, the invisible miracle of synthetic oil was the difference between everything and nothing, even if they never knew its name or understood its chemistry. Their survival was the measure of its success, and their lives were the proof that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one that doesn't look like a weapon at all. It looks like a drum of oil, ordinary and unglamorous, stacked in a depot on a cold English morning, waiting to be poured into engines that will carry men through hell and bring them home again.